All right, what's going on there, folks? Good afternoon. It is the Earthmaster back here on this Friday. Finally, Friday, June 23rd, 2023. A bunch of 23s in there. About 217 here along the west coast. And just taking a look here at the San Andreas Fault. This is one of the images here taken off of the Wikipedia page, which is very useful in terms of information. This is looking at the Carrizo Plain area with Soda Lake visible in the upper left here. This is the plate boundary between the North American and the Pacific plate. Now, this area is of high interest to seismologists and geologists and everyone in general, right? Because we've all seen it in movies and all heard about it growing up, that the big one's coming to Southern California. And, California is going to fall off in the ocean. Technically, that is not geologically possible, far as California falling off into the ocean. That is due to the fact that, a portion of the plate here that is visible above the water has an oceanic crust. So there's no possible way for the California to fall off in the ocean at all. I would see it blowing off the face of the map, if anything. But far as falling off into the ocean, that's not likely. So a lot of people asking, when is the big one going to hit? When is it? And my thoughts on it, I'm going to give you guys just a kind of a video here. It might be a little lengthy, but it's been a while since we've studied the San Andreas Fault here and the history around it. Let me double check, make sure I got everything good. Yes, we do. This article right here, put out this month, fairly recent, and some of you may have read it, some maybe not, but I'm bringing this up here first in the video as to why we have not seen a big one yet along the southern branch of the San Andreas Fault. So let's get into it. Again, this is by the Washington Post here that was put out. I'll provide this article in a link in the description below so you guys can check it out yourself. The wording here is actually kind of interesting because I use it quite a bit as well. A seismic drought or a seismic quiet zone. And that's the San Andreas Fault, at least the southern segment of it is. They mentioned here that fault section is in a seismic drought going more than 300 years without a major earthquake. And by the way, average slip rate with the San Andreas Fault here runs, let me bring this up, let me back out of here real quick, roughly between 0.79 to 1.38 inches per year. That's on average slip rate along the entire fault ranges. So if we just pick a middle ground, say 1 inch per year, and obviously if you times that times 300 years, that's 300 inches. That's 25 feet of strain built up, at least 25 feet of strain built up along the southern end of the San Andreas Fault, which is kind of a big deal. So we look here. They went into a little bit of digging around and found out that the Salton Sea has a lot to do with why we haven't seen an earthquake down there yet. It's got to do with water weight. If you really think about it, a lake of water is a lot of weight on a plate boundary. I keep thinking about like these little pools, these little kiddie pools here. That maybe a toddler can play in, and it takes a few minutes to fill up. They're heavy. Even just, this amount of water in a small little pool, I can barely budge it when it's full. So imagine a huge lake having an effect on a plate boundary here and creating that type of strain and pressure along the San Andreas Fault. The Salton Sea used to be much bigger. We'll check out lake levels here in a minute. But I want to go through this article. One of the largest faults in the world, the 800-mile-long San Andreas, marks the meeting of the North American and Pacific plates in western California. Now, there is three separate sections. Well, not separate, but three named sections. You got the northern section, the central section, and the southern section, which extends from Parkfield, California, all the way down to the Salton Sea. These guys using a little bit of wording here. When the potential earthquake energy is released, it could be catastrophic to nearby populated cities. looking at Los Angeles as one of the main populated regions out there, right? It doesn't sit right smack dab on it, but it's close enough to where we could see, you know, some incredible damage take place from that earthquake when it does happen. And by the way, they're throwing numbers out like an 8.1 at least. But I think the longer, well, you got to consider the fault length, right? A fault length is going to be determined of how much energy can be stored and also the potential magnitude energy released. And they say for this entire, at least the southern segment here, we're talking about 8.1. And that's just the San Andreas Fault. Imagine other fault systems nearby being triggered as well. And that happened. We'll get into that here in a little bit as well. That was during the 1812 earthquake down there, 7.5. We'll check that out here in a little bit. So looks like collecting field data and whatnot near the fault. These folks here, these investigators, determined that earthquakes occurred about every 180 years, give or take 40 years. And that coincided with high water levels of the nearby ancient Lake let's see here. I had that set. It was in my mind. I know I had it. Chaquila, I believe. Okay, so 180-year intervals. If previous earthquakes on it occurred every 180 years, plus or minus 40 years, why is it that we sit on 300 years without a major earthquake? So if you think about it, that lake water level, right, has been dropping like crazy. Let me show you guys the current water level here. This is a little small. Let me blow it up. By the way, this is Westmoreland area down in the southern end of the Salton Sea in Southern California. And their data, at least the data I can get here, only goes back a few years. It goes back to about 2017. I tried to find something a little bit further back to about 2000, but it wouldn't bring it up. It just shows 2017 till now. And there's obviously a gradual decline in the lake level, right? It's continuing to decline. When I was down there a couple years ago, it was an awful experience, let me tell you. I probably won't go back down there again. But the lake level was low even compared to my Google Maps that I was using to find my way around down there. In certain areas where I was at, I should have been underwater or at least in water, and there was just nothing but dry land. So this thing is evaporating like crazy, which, you know, I believe it's firmly delaying the big one, but that's not going to stop the big one from happening. So notice the seasonal patterns here, the up and down seasonal patterns. Of course, when we get rainwater, because it does rain, we get snow melt out there, you know, water does find its way into that lake somehow. But the gradual trend here is showing disappearing. Evaporation. Here's another map here with the water levels showing the up and down pattern with seasonal water inflow and then evaporation and outflow, so to speak, there on that graph. So this team here created a computer model that simulated how a full lake affected the fault. They found that high water levels in the Lake Kahila area, that's Salton Sea now, prompted activity along the fault in two aspects. First, the weight of the lake water caused the crust beneath it to bend. So basically that allowed the slipping or the accumulated strain to slip easier, unlocking the plates so that they don't touch as much. The lake water also seeped into the cracks and pores in Earth's crust beneath it, increasing the fluid pressure inside the fault and further unclasping the plates. So, you know, right now with the lake water dropping like crazy, the strain is there like you couldn't even believe. And it's been building up, right? We're way past that 180-year, say 220. Okay, say the last one should have been 220 years ago. That's still a lot of time that has passed here in terms of, you know, should have happened by now. So the stress is incredibly high. We see large earthquakes taking place around it. We'll get to the earthquake history here in a little bit. So think of this scenario like playing a game of air hockey, which I love, by the way. Without air, the puck does not slide easily across the table, much like when frictional forces hold two stuck tectonic plates together. When air or water from the lake in this picture is added, it helps relieve tension and makes it easier for the two to slip past one another. Right now, it's stuck. The correlation between the stressing rate from the lake loading and the observed earthquake likelihood is astounding. This holds up, then it will be quite important, according to this individual here. Obviously, we'll know a lot more about it when the big one does happen. Our study shows that the lake by itself was sufficient enough to trigger events on the southern branch of the San Andreas Fault and large events. So if you really think about it, that's pretty much anywhere where hydraulic loading and other natural forces exist in nature. They mentioned about China here, where they had a similar event due to the water level change with that 7.9 back in 2008. But could changes to the present-day Salton Sea help trigger an earthquake? Possibly, they state. It looks like back then, when the last earthquake occurred along the southern end of the Salton Sea, the lake was 30 times as big as the present-day Salton Sea area. But that was also fed from the Colorado River. But today, because of drought, the Colorado River is unable to deliver as much water to the Salton Sea region. So, the bad news, the big picture is, right now it's not the volume of lake water that could increase and add stress, but the rate at which the lake could be filled. This is problematic because of plans to restore and potentially refill the Salton Sea. So if that's the case, I wouldn't even mess with that place down there. It's really not a good place. It's very... I don't know. I had a headache for weeks after visiting that area a couple years ago. But I don't know about them filling up this lake. I don't think that would be a good thing, because all that water, I believe, would increase the sooner. It's going to increase the chance that the big one will hit much sooner. If you suddenly rapidly increase the filling of the lake, that might actually stimulate seismicity. That would be really bad for this area, because we already know that so much stress has accumulated on this fault. So the San Andreas Fault is a major plate boundary out here. We know certain areas up here around the Bay Area have had some large earthquakes as well, including that 1906 earthquake back in 1906. That was a, not for sure why this isn't working. It's kind of odd, right? As soon as I get, well, now it wants to work. I don't know what's going on. That's really weird. There we go. USGS messing with me right in the middle of a update. Oh yeah, so this was along the San Andreas Fault here, 1906, 7.9, pretty big one. But this area down here, the southern branch, extends, as I mentioned, from Parkfield all the way down to the Salton Sea, is capable of producing an 8.1. Now the largest one, back in that, what is going on here? Let me see if I can refresh this. Maybe it'll help out a little bit. Something's going on with the... Wow, I'm not for sure, but it's acting weird. 7.5. Back in 1812. So we're talking about over 200 years ago was when, somewhat of the last big one happened. But they believe this earthquake, the 7.5, occurred back in 1812, was basically a fault system nearby, the San Jacinto Fault, and also the San Andreas Fault, slipping at the same time. There's been a lot of studies on this, even some folks thinking that it wasn't even on the San Andreas Fault, but it comes to the conclusion that this activity struck on the San Andreas Fault here, but also at the same time along with the San Jacinto Fault. They call it a joint rupture here, both the SAF and the San Jacinto Fault Zone. At least according to their latest study back, I believe they did one back in 2010. This one says 1980s. but they did state that I believe is a likely scenario. So you got one earthquake triggering the other, or at the same time. But that means there's a lot of stress down there. The San Jacinto Fault Zone is a pretty lengthy fault, which sits down here, kind of branches off of the San Andreas Fault here. It extends way down south here, much further south into the, almost close down to here to the border. As you can see, there's been numerous large earthquakes there. It is on the Pacific side of the plate boundary. Plate boundary right here. And yeah, they believe that that may have been just a joint earthquake sequence there. So that's why sometimes I think that maybe when we see swarming activity down here or other moderate earthquake activity, that could, you know, definitely trigger the big one down here, the southern end of the San Andreas Fault. The average slip rate here, as I mentioned, up to about 1.38 on average. So that's still quite a bit of strain. The general plate dynamics here shows the North American plate heading off to the southeast, while the Pacific plate, and that includes Los Angeles area, right? They're on the Pacific plate. Always, I think you heard in school, or at least my teachers told me, one of these days, Los Angeles and San Francisco are going to be side by side, because the Pacific plate here is heading off to the northwest, while the North American plate kind of goes off to the southeast here. And that shows that in the plate boundary map here as well. 2 arrows along the west coast. With the general plate movement of the massive North American and the massive Pacific plate, you can see these arrows kind of pointing in this general direction. But the general plate dynamics here along the San Andreas Fault is as listed. So we really, you know, the big one is definitely the big one's bigger than a 7.5. I don't think that released entire amount of stress out here across this plate boundary. 7.5 is definitely a large earthquake, and even so, that's been over 200 years. So far as general newer earthquake activity out here, yes, we've seen it up in Ridgecrest, but that's a ways away from the plate boundary. But it just goes to show you how strong and how much tension and stress can build up here along the plate boundary itself. We've seen other smaller quakes around that 7.5 level. The 6.4 back in 1899. That's going to be the 7.5. This one right here, 6.3 back in 1857. So we've had quite a bit of earthquake activity along the plate boundary, but it's older. A lot of old movement. A lot of people think this one up here was the big one, and it is a big quake, but that was not even on the San Andreas Fault. I believe this was on the White Wolf Fault Zone, if I remember right. Not on the San Andreas Fault, but definitely associated with the strain that builds up here along the west coast. That was back in 1952. One up here. Not for sure what's going on with this. 1857. 7.9 earthquake. That occurred just off the San Andreas Fault Zone along a couple other fault systems here, which is another sign of, you know, a lot of presence of stress out here along this major plate boundary. That's definitely a big one. 1857, but that's coming up on almost 200 years now. So, you know, the big one, I think, has a lot to do with weather and the lake water activity down here. Let me go, not Calaveras. We're going to check into that here in just a little bit because a lot of people are wanting to know about fault systems around the Bay Area. We'll check that out here in just a minute. But Salton Sea area, I think, has a lot to do with the lake water level. It's a pretty big one, right? Definitely a large lake. A lot of weight when that thing is full. So we'll see if they fill this up or not. I don't understand the reasoning behind that, but I think the longer we go without the big one happening up here, regardless on if this gets filled up or if it continues to shrink, I think it will be. I think it'll be quite the jolt down here in Southern California when this thing does decide to slip. I think it'll be more of a violent type jolt compared to past large events when they happened here over 300 years ago. So definitely an interesting article here. Let's see. Not much fear-mongering in here. This is all pretty much factual information and scenarios that could take place if they decide to fill up that lake. So let's get back here to events that take place down south here, because the general plate movement, a lot of times we'll see swarming activity kick up down south, and it will migrate up here to the north along the Brawley seismic zone. And I've seen that numerous times, and it never triggered the big one. But how close does one swarm have to be to trigger this thing? If you really think about it, this thing's about as wound up as tight as it can be. It's been well over 300 years, and the average intervals, as they stated, was about 180 years or so on average. So a lot of time has passed, a lot of strain built up, a lot has happened since then in at least around this plate boundary. We've seen numerous large earthquakes throughout time across this area down here. Brawley seismic zone seen a 6.3 back in 1906, coincidentally, right, with that big one up north in the San Francisco region. I don't know why this thing's messing up. 6.9 back in 1940. Swarms, thousands of earthquakes of swarms here over the years. Not showing it, but even if we were to show, let's bring up this year's activity, because we did have a few interesting events take place down there. I'm going to go 0.1, and I'm not going to go back to the year 1000 because that's just a number I threw up there. So I'm going to go 2023, but I want to go back just to about to January, because that's when we had some pretty good swarming going on down there south of El Centro. Not going to use that because that is a little crazy. We don't need that many earthquakes. Let's go down here. Just want to show you guys the swarming that's been taking place, because I think that plays a major part in how much stress is building up out there. And I do think one of these days, right about here, I think that'd be perfect. Hopefully my computer doesn't melt down. Let's see. This is like pretty much all magnitudes. Okay, it wasn't too bad. And this goes to show you the swarming area that's come very close here to the southern branch of the San Andreas Fault, at least here on the map. We had like 3 separate swarming areas. One south here, north of Mexicali, that was triggered quite a bit of earthquake activity here. Just in this region, we've seen about 233. Still seeing some this month, but most of that happened back in late April, as you can see there, April 28th, April 29th, when there was just a massive swarm of activity. And that sits just off of the Imperial Fault, which is kind of an extensional plate boundary out here from the San Andreas Fault. You got the Brawley seismic zone, Imperial Fault, and a couple other fault systems that are somewhat secondary here to the plate boundary itself on the Pacific side. Now this is the San Jacinto Fault zone that I believe some of those swarming activity did kick up on. You can see the secondary swarm up here in this region. Now the secondary swarm kicked up following this activity down south. And then about that time, we seen another separate swarm kick up here. This was about the same time there in April. We did have some activity, obviously, this month, but look, April 30th, April 29th, a little bit back in February too, but we've seen a separate swarm that kicked up here much closer to the San Andreas Fault and on the Brawley seismic zone. So that was very interesting here. I was watching that for almost 24 hours each day when this was going on, but it came to a halt, just shy of the plate boundary itself. But we even had a little one right here underneath the Salton Sea region. I don't even know if there's water right there at that level, but when stuff like this happens is when I'm on my tippy toes and got my antennas up, because I believe that's when we're going to see something happen up here along the San Andreas Fault. Yes, there's been many swarms in the past. They haven't triggered it, but how many more swarms is it going to take? How much more of that increasing energy applied in this area is it going to take before it finally decides to just pop? And that's going to be the wording for it, because we don't have that lubrication, that lake level stress that's been kind of bending the plates down here, allowing easier slippage from this region to take place in years past, like 300 years ago. Less water weight, more dynamic pressure applied out here with no plate bending will create more of a jolt of an earthquake at 8.1 magnitude. That is going to be a pretty dandy one when it takes place. So my thoughts: when we see swarming activity, that's when I issue an earthquake watch out here for California. I'll always try to, because that's when I believe things could get interesting. Any type of swarming anywhere could be an indicator of something bigger coming. Obviously, it's an indicator of some regional stress like we had seen out here earlier this year in April, but it didn't trigger the big one. Not yet. But it's close to that zone, right? It's really close into that triggering zone. Even Dr. Lucy Jones chats about that triggering zone, which I think she said about 1 to 3 miles is where, local nearby earthquake activity could bump this, and just, could just be the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? Is that how it goes, I think? In this case, would trigger that big one up there. So just what do we got for right now? Let me go to the most recent activity here and see what we got. It's been awfully quiet down here in California, Southern California specifically. Not a whole lot going on. San Jacinto Fault Zone is almost, there's always small earthquake activity, and sometimes we'll see little separate swarming regions here that kick up. But this is a major fault system here that's just secondary here to the San Andreas Fault. And of course the Elsinore fault system as well, back further along the Pacific plate. But it makes sense to see more increasing activity here along this secondary fault system here that's very close to the plate boundary, right? That's where all the stress builds up. And a lot of strain does sometimes show up on these other faults. But for now, they're sleeping. It's very quiet down there in the Southern California area. A lot of people asking about the Hayward Fault, the Calaveras Fault. Recent studies have found that there is a deep connection between the Hayward Fault and the Calaveras Fault, which could trigger one another. There's the deep connection fault here in the blue, and then they found a new Hayward surface trace that connects that as well. So this whole area is definitely primed for some movement as well. Now, they have, let's see, where is their estimates at? Probabilities. Now, not for sure when this one was put out. Let me see here. I think this needs to be updated. Overall chance, so it looks like San Francisco Bay Area region, 62% probability for 1 or more magnitude 6.7 or greater from 2003 to 2032. So this model may have been put out prior to that year. I don't see any updated date on this thing, so this may be old. But back then, they're showing only a 27% probability of this magnitude to about 2032. I think this is much higher. I'm not for sure why this hasn't been updated yet. Yeah, so I'll have to look into that a little bit more. But either way, you know, it doesn't matter where you look at. You know, I always see this magnitude right here. They're talking about the southern end of the San Andreas Fault, 8.1. Kind of a big number for sure. But the central portion here, northern segment, I think the connection between these two fault systems here do show a likelihood of a larger quake compared to just one rupturing. If you have two of these being connected at the surface and in deep levels, that's not a good sign. That could be that could definitely be a bad thing for this area. So the Calaveras Fault here looks like the most recent updated earthquake was back in 2022 with a 5.1, which is moderate sized earthquake. Will cause a little bit of damage. And let's see here. They've had some big ones in the past, obviously. 6.2, 5.6. Here's the mention of the Hayward Fault connection. Although it has been known for some time that the Calaveras and the Hayward Fault merge into the South Bay region, recent geological studies suggest that the Calaveras and Hayward Faults may be even more closely connected horizontally deep beneath the surface, angling towards each other with depth until they become a single fault. That's not good. If true, this would have significant implications for the potential maximum strength of earthquakes on the Hayward Fault, because that would make it technically a longer fault zone, right? A larger fault zone. Since the strength is determined by the maximum length of the fault rupture, and this rupture could extend beyond the juncture point to include some portion of the Calaveras, which would mean a much larger earthquake in that area. So the probabilities and magnitudes there, magnitudes are much higher. Probabilities, let's go, let's check out the Calaveras Fault zone here. I just want to look up real quick here. Custom, go 6.0 and above. I'm just going to look at the specific areas around the bay. Was just going to keep this on the San Andreas Fault, but I had a couple people asking me about the Calaveras Fault zone, and specifically this area where they join together into the San Andreas Fault. 6.0 and above. There's a Napa earthquake. I remember feeling that one back in 2014. Loma Prieta earthquake. That was actually just off the San Andreas Fault on a branch of the San Andreas Fault here. One of these fault systems here. 1906 earthquake. 7.9. That was smack dab on the San Andreas Fault. Now the Calaveras Fault zone, again, runs up here on this map. Looking at historical data, quite a few sixes back here, but they're all older. 1858, 1984 was a 6.2, Seven Trees, California quake. And then 1864, seen as 6.1. The Hayward Fault, 6.8, 1868. Quite a few years have passed since then. 7.4, 1838. Well, it didn't take long for that to build up stress up here, did it? Not even 100 years. Then I had a 7.9. So this could have been some type of forequake activity. Remember, this is a giant plate boundary. So the Hayward Fault, I think, is a more dangerous fault system out here through the Bay region. But with the likelihood association with the Calaveras Fault zone, that makes them both even more dangerous. 1868. That's 2014. Just trying to get a little visual here. A lot of time has passed either way in between the Bay Area and also Southern California. You know, it's just a lot of people think, well, California already had a big one here, the 7.1 or 7.2 back in Ridgecrest back in 2019. Well, no, we didn't. That's not a big one for California, and it's not even associated with all the plate tectonic stress that's been building up out here. So there's definitely a heightened sense of what's coming as far as earthquake activity goes. It's not going to be like the movie San Andreas. California is not going to fall off in the ocean. You can see the oceanic crust out here, the islands. Technically, there's no possible way for that to even happen. But they will get a good jolt, no doubt. And my fear is that possibly we could trigger even some further areas up north. See if we get a bigger one down south here, that could trigger further activity along the plate boundary itself, producing big ones up in San Francisco. So it's just it's a matter of waiting, right? Lake levels, the water pressure has a lot to do with it. California received a bunch of rainfall this past winter, but not necessarily in this area of the state down here. The Southern California region, I'm not for sure how much water runs into this area. There's obviously some, as we've seen on the seasonal patterns here, how they go up and then they go back down. Here's the lake level in the past 2 years. Well, this looks like 1 year. Notice around January, February, March, when we had significant storms out here, that water level looks like it increased, but now we're starting to go back down. All the snow's starting to melt, getting drier conditions out there. But the long-range model will show that that continuing to decline. But that will not stop the big one from occurring, folks. That's just that's a fact. So my job is to just keep watching this, keep updating, keeping an eye on swarming areas and activity. That's why I run live seismograph stations here. Looks like a couple of these are offline. Barrett is down there in Southern California. It looks that's just the way the Webb recorder is kind of drawing out the data right now on the digital scale. But the Barrett station sits right around here, and sometimes we'll see swarming activity kick up on it. But as I mentioned, Southern California right now is just awfully quiet. So what's it going to take? What do you guys think it's going to take? I kind of want to know your thoughts on this as well. We do have a lot of geology and earth science viewers on this channel, so I'm just kind of curious what your take is on this. And I'm not. You can throw up whatever you want, far as opinions or your subjective views of this plate boundary and the long extended time that it's been since we've had the big one. I want to get your opinions, what you guys think. I want to make this into actually a really cool discussion if we can here in the comments, because eventually it's going to hit. Los Angeles will feel the effects, no doubt, through here. They'll probably get amplified, if anything, because of the basin that it sits on out here. Probably will amplify and bounce back and forth in between these mountain ranges and amplify that 8.1 when it does come in. I think they've mentioned about liquefaction issues there as well. So just, a matter of time. Everything's about time, isn't it? Speaking of time, I got to get out there real quick and do a little bit of yard work. But I just wanted to cover a little bit of information here on the San Andreas Fault and the potential. 25 feet, that's just on average of accumulated stress that's built up here in 300 years since it's had its last large earthquake. So I will continue to watch it here, folks. No swarming for now. Knock on wood, but it's an interesting topic, right? Plate plate tectonics in general are very, very interesting. And living in some interesting times here. It's been relatively quiet. Got the Cascadia subduction zone up north. 323 years since that one popped. So who knows? We may just have one active day or a couple days here in the near future where everything decides to catch up. It's a good possibility. We'll be back a little bit later on tonight, folks, with a complete update. Just wanted to do just a little summary on the activity there, or lack of activity at the San Andreas Fault. Chime in below. Let me know what you guys think here in this update video. I'll catch you guys back here a little bit later tonight. Have a good one.